So since we are not meeting in a face-to-face course to demonstrate some of the basic concepts of genealogy, this video is intended to show you how genealogists go about layering pieces of information to create a larger whole. However, one of the things that I want to point out before we start is this doesn't show any of the background work or the process of researching. As you will start, you will find that a great many of the places you search won't have what you're looking for, and the further back you go, the more this will happen. There is no one single document that will answer all of your questions. There may be no answers with some questions. Most of us do not have the good fortune of being descended from well-documented royalty. So a good chunk of your time is going to be spent running down the individual pieces of information. This is why research logs are so useful, since they minimize redundancy during your investigations. I also want to point out another way that I'm cheating. Don't get me wrong, this is a real person and these are real records that I'll be showing you. But the person I selected to start this outline has several things in his favor. He's male. He's white. He's living in an urban area and lived his whole life in the United States, and in fact lived his whole life in Louisville, Kentucky. He has an intact family to help me confirm that he is the correct person. His name is uncommon. You may be able to see how each of these points is beneficial to me as a researcher, since it means that he has more of an easily identifiable presence in his community. For this example that I'll be showing you today, I'm only pulling from sources that are available in some form online, though not all of them are necessarily available through Ancestry or open databases. So without further ado, may I present to you James Allen Ruffra, Sr. I should mention he's in my tree, but we share no relationship. One of those related to someone who's married to someone who's related to someone types of things. Though if any of you are related to him, please let the group know. That would be amazing and weird. Now since I'm cheating in explaining this to you, I can spoil the beginning and tell you that Jimmy Sr. was a fourth-generation American whose great-grandpa Fred came from Germany and apparently plopped right down in Louisville and never left. Stable families like this are much easier to trace, of course, which is why I'm using him. So let's start at a place where you would likely be when researching. In genealogy, you're nearly always going backwards. So we're going to begin with the poor man's death on December 6th, 2008. We've got a couple of likely places to start. The bad news, for us at least, is that James Ruffra died after 1965 in Kentucky. 1965 is the latest year for Kentucky death certificates that have been released for public record. So that's out for us. But let's start with some low-hanging fruit. This is a screenshot from James Ruffra's Find a Grave entry. A kind soul has entered in some information here for us to start with. However, there are a couple of things to keep in mind with this information on Find a Grave and similar sites. The first thing, the biggest thing, is that we don't know the true origin of this information, which is a problem with a lot of these sites. There is a great deal of information on them, but not necessarily any effort to list the actual source of the information. Now there is a person listed at the bottom of the page, the person who entered the information. A person can be a source. However, this person is not identifying themselves as a source and is likely not a family member. And keep in mind, on the internet, I can call myself the Queen of Sheba if I want. If the information looks reasonable, use it and cite it, but don't rely on it as your only source. You really need to find a reliable source for this information. In this record, she was nice enough to enter in the obituary and credit the Courier Journal, but we're really going to need to check the Courier Journal directly to verify the information is correct. There are also some calculated relationships. However, we don't know where the information is from or how accurate it is. I do encourage you to use sites like this, just don't trust the information until you can corroborate it. When you add pieces of information, by all means, credit the source to Find a Grave, but find the origin of the information or other sources to confirm. And aside from the information here, there are two other possible sources for error. First is the volunteer herself who entered this, especially since we don't have an image of the original gravestone to confirm the name and dates. And the second is the gravestone itself. You will regularly find errors on tombstones, especially regarding the person's birthday. I have not actually done this because of the creep factor, but if you dig around the bottom of the stone, you will find the name of the monument company. You now have another source. That said, look closely at this information. The top lists some pretty concrete information, the name and location of the actual gravestone, including the cemetery and exact plot. Some larger cemeteries have their own website. The Cave Hill Cemetery page lists James' military service and confirms plot information. The second piece is an obituary attributed to the Courier-Journal, which we can verify. And the third are links to other individuals who are possibly family members, but we need more information before adding these people to the family group sheet. We've got a really obvious place to check next, since this cites the Courier-Journal obituary. The Courier-Journal is available on microfilm at select libraries. If you're trying to find places that carry a particular resource, you can usually go to WorldCat. I know this is slightly off topic for this, but worldcat.org is an important resource for librarians and genealogists if you're not already familiar with it. For the Louisville Courier-Journal, it lists multiple formats: online, newspaper, and microfilm. You can check libraries for each format. Okay, so I accessed James Ruffro's obituary through the ProQuest database that the Louisville Free Public Library subscribes to, and sure enough, here it is. Now, obituaries are excellent sources of information. However, keep in mind that these are often written by grieving family members after death, so it is not uncommon for certain details to be wrong or omitted. They can also be included in family drama and hostilities. However, while obituaries are not the highest quality of possible information, they are very good sources. In this particular obituary, we see a lot of different facts. We have a place of origin, age, place, and date of death, references to specifics of a military career, references to a long-term career and specialty, hobbies, memberships, religious affiliations and a specific church, 2 different wives and the current status, 4 generations of family members, both living and dead, and their relationships to him, funeral home and funeral information, and burial information. Sometimes a potential cause of death can even be inferred from the suggestions for donations for the expressions of sympathy, but approach that one very carefully. That is a lot of information about a person, and it potentially gives you a great many types of facts that can be pursued to flesh out your information and confirm the pieces. We are not going to pursue all of them, but choose a couple of records to look at and trace back. For James, we know exactly when and where he died, but not exactly when he was born. For that, let's turn to the Social Security Death Index, available on Ancestry. The last residence is not necessarily a place of death, so don't assume that. However, this gives us an exact birth date for our James. The good news is, James was born after 1910. In Kentucky, birth and death certificates were not required by law until 1911. The birth index lists the child's name, place of birth, date of birth, and mother's name with her maiden name, though often the married name is listed on the oldest birth records. Birth records might exist before 1911, but certificates were not required until 1911. You can see the last name is spelled differently. You will see this a lot in genealogy, so don't let it faze you. Misspellings could be a transcription error, a simple misunderstanding on the original record, or the result of no standardized spelling if the person or family wasn't literate. One of Donna's ancestors' name was spelled Merkle, but her name was Mercury. She spelled it Merkel her whole life, but pronounced Mercury at fast. Just note spelling differences and move on. Death records before 1968 are public record, though KDLA has only scanned death records to 1964 at this point. Even though the law states a 100-year wait on birth certificates, the state has decided this is not enough, and they must confirm that the person has passed. At this point in time, you might be able to request birth certificates for November and December of 1910. You can request death records through the Kentucky Department of Vital Statistics, though there are fees involved per record, and you must show your relationship to the person whose records you are requesting. But back to Jimmy here. We've used a few records to determine descendants, and now we're moving backwards. We have his sister's name, Rita Day, from his obituary, and his mother's name, Emma Schaaf, from his birth index record. So we've got a solid lead with Mother Emma. Let's keep following that. In Ancestry, I followed the prompts through to find the Kentucky Birth Index, 1911 to 1999. When you're starting to use an unfamiliar records collection, don't forget to take a minute to look up the information about the database and where it gets its information from. In the search boxes for the Kentucky Birth Index, I did a search for children born with the surname Rufra, born to Emma Schaaf. This was the list of results that I got. As you see, there's James's sister Rita, born shortly after he was and also in Jefferson County, so this fits with a piece of information we already have. You also see some Rufras born to Irma Schaaf. These may or may not be siblings with Emma spelled incorrectly, so we won't do anything with that information yet, one way or another. We have the names, birth dates, and locations for 2 children in the family, maybe more, we're not sure yet, and the mother's name. Now let's use those to see if we can find the family unit in a census. Remember, there is a 72-year hold on the release of the federal censuses. At this point, the only available U.S. censuses for James and Rita will be the 1930 or the 1940. So after searching, I find a very likely family in 1930 living with Catherine Schaaf in Louisville. With the number of confirming pieces of information, you can conclude this is the correct family with a very high level of certainty. Ancestry and Family Search have done a very good job of indexing the census entries, and they're not the only websites to do so. The one for head of household, Catherine, looks like this. I've split it in 2 so you can see it a bit on the screen. However, one of the things I learned the hard way is don't just look at the record transcription. Look at the actual census page. Censuses have an insane amount of information, and it won't be useful to you even to try to infer information about the family unless you know it's there. And the collected information is not necessarily consistent from census to census, so pay close attention. It will get easier as you gain experience. They ask different questions with different censuses that can be more or less useful to you as you do your research. So we won't be here all day. I won't go into any depth for the different pieces of information since there are so many. So in the 1930 census page that we're looking at, we have all of these pieces of information about one family. The specific location of the house, including the district and ward, the date of the house visit by the census taker and the census taker's name, the actual street or intersection the house is on, the house number, the names of all members of the family, and the relationship of that person to the head of the household, whether they rent or own the house, Hello Deed records, and the value, which gives a hint on the family's wealth. Sex, marital status, age, race. For 1930, the age at first marriage, which is not necessarily the age married for the current marriage. Education, literacy, state or country of birth, and for both of that person's parents. Language spoken, citizenship status. The language codes deal with the origin countries or regions of the parents. The occupation, the industry of that occupation. The current employment status, veteran status, and the war served, and farm schedule information. This is a lot of information giving a multifaceted snapshot of a family. This is a primary document since it is being created at a moment in time, but the information in it is secondary, since it is just what was written by asking questions of the people in or possibly around the home. And we've said it before, and I'll say it again, people absolutely lie on these, or just don't remember. I can't tell you how many people aged 7 years in a 10-year period. It's pretty amazing. So just attempt to corroborate as many pieces of information as you can before taking it as gospel. Remember, it is not until the 1940 census that we even know who provided the information for that particular household. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to do what I just told you not to do and focus on just a couple of pieces of information. We established his parents' names, ages, and birthplaces, and also identify a grandmother. Catherine Schaaf is explicitly listed as Emma's mother. And Alphonse Rufra, James's father, has a wonderfully unique name. We also know an approximate birth date and location. Using the online Kentucky Death Index information, I find out that Alphonse Rufra died in 1977, so I dug up the obituary. This confirms that we are looking at the correct Alphonse Rufra. This gives us age, date of death, address, origin, career, and living family members, along with the church, burial information, and funeral home. And it confirms Emma's maiden name. It also strongly implies that the Rufer children born to Irma Schaef that we weren't sure of before are a completely different family. It does not give any sibling or parent names for Alphonse, but we'll get there. The Social Security Death Index for Alphonse gives us his birth date, which is our first time into the 19th century. So we've got Alphonse's birth and death date. If you look carefully at the 1930 census, you will have noticed two details. The first is that the age of first marriage was 10 years before for both people. This implies that their marriage took place 10 years ago to each other, since having had a previous spouse before the current one would have meant a different age at first marriage would have been listed. So you can infer that their marriage took place around roughly 1920. The second piece of information is that Alphonse is listed as a veteran of the Great War, which means it might be worth looking for a military service database covering World War I. Sure enough, Ancestry has the scanned image of a World War I draft card. Now, the birth date and location match. The name is interesting, Albert instead of Alphonse. However, Albert sounds like a likely Americanization for the name Alphonse. This is a very likely match, but not quite close enough for me to accept without a little more digging. For the information on here, Albert is listing his father's name as Frank. So let's turn to finding different records that might confirm or contradict this record. Ancestry doesn't list any marriage records for Alphonse, but Family Search tends to be a bit stronger with Kentucky marriage records. In Family Search, there is an indexed listing to Alphonse's marriage to Emma in 1920. The details are fairly convincing. The details that we do know with the approximate marriage date and the names of Alphonse, Emma, and her mother, Catherine Schaef, from the census match this. It also lists Alphonse's parents' names, Frank and Lena, and Emma's unknown father's name as Henry Schaef. Unfortunately, the image for this record is not available to check the transcription with the original, but it is looking much more likely that the Albert Rufer draft record is the correct one for Alphonse. It is entirely possible that Alphonse temporarily Americanized his name to sound less German during a time of undoubtedly high tension with a lot of anti-German sentiment in the United States. Ancestry has another useful database listing Albert, the lists of men ordered to report to local board for military duty in 1917 to 1918. Keep in mind that reporting for the draft was different from being called up to active service. It lists his date of final acceptance at the mobilization camp to be September 27, 1917. The date on his original draft card was June 5th of that year. In Kentucky, the mobilization camp would have been Fort Thomas. At this point, we are now getting a better picture of the Alphonse Rufer family. Another great way to trace a family is through cross directories when they are available. This can give you an almost yearly snapshot sometimes of the family's movement. For those unfamiliar with the concept of a cross directory, also called a polk directory, cross directories list the information in multiple sections, usually 3 sections. The earliest ones list city residents alphabetically by their last names, alphabetical street names by house number, and then alphabetical by business subject, like a modern-day Yellow Pages. Modern cross-directories list residents alphabetical by last name, alphabetical street names by house number, and numerically by phone number. The downside of cross-directories is that they are usually only available for city areas, no rural areas, though a handful of rural directories might exist for your area, but don't expect to see your families in there if they live outside of the city limits. Old Louisville cross-directories are available in a few places online, including Ancestry for some of the 1920s and the Hathi Trust for a few from 1873 to 1909. Hathi Trust requires no login either. In 1922, Alphonse shows up in Louisville, along with who is likely his dad. He may very well be related to some of the other roofers listed here. It lists his occupation, and his address is 433 East Oak. The B in front of that stands for boards. There is usually a list of abbreviations at the beginning of the directory or the section, so be sure to check that you know what is being actually said. So when we flip to the section with the streets and go to Oak for East Oak Street, we scroll down to 433 and discover that 433 East Oak is owned by Henry Schaaf, grocer, his wife Emma's dad. At this point, we've basically looked at 10 separate records to get a very basic outline of 3 generations of James's family. 6 if you include all of his still living children and their children and children's children. There are still a lot of gaps, but the more records we find will overlap with details and flesh out more about the individuals. Which leads us to Frank and Lena, James's grandparents. At this point, we know their names and not much else. Alphonse's obituary also did not mention any names of his siblings, which could mean he was an only child, or the last of his siblings to die, or that the family didn't want to pay for more word space, or any number of reasons they may not have shown up. However, we do know specific details about Alphonse, including his name, exact birth date, and at least that he was born in Jefferson County, according to his draft card. So let's start there. He would likely have not been mentioned in the 1890 census, even if it had not been water damaged in a fire on the floor above, but the 1910 census shows us a very likely-looking family group. In Spring Garden, in Jefferson County, Alphonse is listed as a laborer on the home farm. This census gives us the approximate ages of Frank and Lena, as well as listing that 7 of their 8 children are still living, and, lucky for us, are all still living on the farm. Edward, Joseph, Alphonse, Frank Jr., William, Lawrence, and Louis. 7 boys. That poor woman. We actually find out later that Frank Ruffra wasn't actually 39 at this time, which would have made him born in 1871. In 1900, he is listed as being born in 1869. He is only aged 8 years in a 10-year period. His wife Lena has aged an amazing 6 years in a 10-year period. It is likely that the children's ages in their early censuses are the correct ones, since people tend to find no reason to lie about children's ages, and when their ages are clustered close together, it makes it a lot harder to lie about. They are listed as being married 12 years in 1900 and 21 years in 1910, which puts their likely marriage date at around 1887 to 1888. Sure enough, a marriage license found on both Ancestry and Family Search was granted on November 19, 1888, to Frank Ruffra and Lena Kunstler, and the certificate shows them getting married on November 21st in Louisville, though Lena's full name here is listed as Magdalena Kunstler. Be sure to also take note of any witness names as well, since those are often family members. It is also sometimes worth checking the local newspaper around those times for either the listing of those who received marriage licenses or those who've gotten married. Families might formally announce an engagement, or the society section might mention a party. Sometimes considerable details are given about the ceremony, even sometimes describing all of the family in attendance present, and the details of the bride's dress and flowers. In the November 24, 1888 Courier Journal, it does at least list them as, quote, voyagers upon the matrimonial sea, along with many other couples who were issued marriage licenses in Jefferson County. This has traced the family back 120 years at this point. However, we can potentially go back even further by paradoxically going a little bit ahead. Kentucky death certificates are a huge wealth of information, though be cautious. The death information itself can be considered highly reliable and is a primary source. The family information, however, relies on the knowledge of the informant, whose name is listed on the certificate and is considered a secondary source. For Frank Ruffra, his death certificate has a very high level of certainty that it is his. His wife Lena is listed as the informant. I won't even go into the level of detail available here, but I very, very strongly recommend reading every line of the death certificate you are finding, especially until you get familiar with all of the types of information included. You can find a lot of death certificates available. If you don't have access to Ancestry, you can access a bunch of them on Family Search as well. Also keep in mind that for those doing family research to understand genetic diseases or predispositions, death certificates are valuable and often include primary and secondary causes of death. as well as references to whether there was violence involved or an autopsy completed. It is sometimes possible to find the coroner's reports. Frank died on November 11th, 1930. His parents are both listed on his death certificate, though his mother has no maiden name listed, which is unfortunate but not uncommon. Fred and Elizabeth are both listed as being German-born. This will hopefully give you a sense of the way to bring various sources together to build your information about your individuals, to get a more complete sense of the family and what they looked like and what they did. Even if you find completed trees online, check the sources of their information and be sure that the information they're citing actually backs up the facts that they claim. It is common to get contradictory or confusing pieces of evidence as you search, so be sure not to add information until you have reasonable confidence in it being the correct piece of information. Also keep in mind people with similar names as you do research. As with anything, the more you do it, the better you get, and I really hope that you enjoy the journey.